Dean and Mia. We stayed at Maxwell's. Down
there you go. Dean and Mia, 2 degrees
Florence.
of separation.
That's great publicity for Dean and Mia, because we are now live on Facebook and live on YouTube. Hello, Facebook and YouTube. And we are excited to do a 103rd anniversary program on the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne with Robert Laplander and Derek Sansone. And did Robert leave?
I think he just accidentally clicked off, but he should be joining right now.
Oh, that dirty rat. Because I was just going to tell him that we're going to have Derek go first and then Robert. There you go.
He is.
Look, he didn't even miss stride. He didn't even break stride. I'll rename him. Robert, I just want to tell you that we're going to have Derek go first. And he's got like a 25-minute presentation, an overview of the Battle of the Moosargon, and skirting around the Lost Battalion, not really talking about it. And then we'll turn to the Lost Battalion, if you don't mind, turn to you and, give you the rest of the program. And we like it to be an interactive program with Q&A. And I know we'll have 2 people joining us whose fathers fought in the 28th Infantry Division and at the Moosargon, and they're really curious to hear about this, and I'd like to get what they know about their father's service maybe towards the end. But we tend to have a pretty active chat here on the Zoom side and on the Facebook side, and we are ready to go live and start letting everybody in, right, Ellie?
Yes, we are. All right, let's get started.
Hello and welcome everybody on this Monday, September 27th. It was 103 years ago yesterday that the largest battle in American history began, the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. It was the largest, and also I would say Robert Laplander might say the bloodiest battle, I believe, in American history. And it was one that had a lot of lessons learned for the U.S. Army and the U.S. military generally. And we have 2 experts on the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. Robert Laplander joins us. He is truly the leading expert in the Lost Battalion, an important critical story from the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. And we have Derek Sansone, who is a Navy Seabee, but he is also a self-taught expert on World War I, very involved in both. Robert and Derek are very involved in the World War I Centennial Commission and the World War I, the National World War I Memorial, which just recently opened up in Washington, D.C. So we want to jump into the story of World War I. First, I want to say hello to Sean Hall. Hi, Sean. How are you? Our Director of Programming.
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks.
And you have a new Scuttlebutt podcast episode?
Yeah, this one starts a series for us, sort of an Afghanistan series. Ryan All, sort of my co-host on the Scuttlebutt, his dad was working over there and was evacuated from the embassy in mid-August. He chose to come on to the Scuttlebutt, talk about his story about how he was evacuated and what he experienced over there. Really interesting story. So definitely check it out on our website or check it out on YouTube. That's again the start of a series. So next we'll have a veteran, Adam Zafuto, a 2-parter, him talking about his experience serving in Afghanistan, and then we'll finish up the series with an Afghan interpreter. So this is part 1. Definitely check it out. It's a great story. Okay,
so this is part 1 of a 3-part series on the war in Afghanistan, reflections on the war in Afghanistan. Wonderful. How are you, Ellie? Ellie is in Chicago.
Doing well.
That's good. That's good. And I'm Todd, and I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we're a nonprofit that has been around for 13 years, based in Pittsburgh, PA. And ever since last year, we started doing our programming, which is all about sharing veteran stories, getting veterans together with the public to share stories. And this Zoom format, this, social media format, video conferencing format, has allowed us to do things like meet interesting people like Derek and Robert and kind of gather people nationwide and even outside the country to hear these stories and learn a little bit about history. I'm a historian. I'm not a veteran. And so we often like to, take a program and focus on the history that's past, even if we don't have living veterans among us who served. This is an event that is not in our most Americans' living memory. But it's an important episode nonetheless. I also want to first of all, hey, Sean and Ellie, I'm going to be out of town Thursday and Friday.
Where are you going?
I'm going to the National U.S. Army Museum on Thursday and the National Museum of the United States Marine Corps on Friday. And I'm going with 25 people on a bus, a chartered bus, chartered by the Veterans Breakfast Club. And my new concern now is, if the government shuts down midnight Thursday, will the Marine Corps Museum be open? Does anybody know? I'll have to look into that. Okay, I'll call the museum tomorrow just to make sure. So I want to go to Jeff Ballard, and we have Harmon Ward and Jeff Ballard with us. And I invited them to come on because they have an interesting program they're involved with. It is the Historical Miniature Gaming Society, and there's a major event coming up at University of California at Fullerton in California. Jeff, could you tell us a little bit about what historical miniature gaming is?
Well, I think Harmon would be, Harmon is the convention director, and he has been involved with Historical Miniature Gaming Society for decades. I'm kind of a newbie. This is my third year involvement in my second Mini Wars convention, but I think Harmon should kick us off.
Harmon, are you with us?
He said he's able to hear us.
He could hear us. Can we see him? Oh, okay. Let me hear. Harmon, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I am unmuted.
There you go. Hey, Harmon, how are you?
Fantastic. Doing excellent. I just got off work and I'm driving to an appointment. And so I pulled over and I'm ready to tell everybody about what we do.
Thank you. Yeah. How would you pitch historical miniature gaming to somebody who really knew nothing about it?
All of us have seen a black and white movie of the command center at the Battle of Britain with everybody in suits pushing aircraft across the table to get a visualization of what was happening up in the air, in some cases, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. In the age before computers, generals, colonels, majors, they would do this type of thing all the time. They would run through war games using models to represent the actual units in the field, and they would replay existing historical battles or plan for the future of when they would meet enemies that they didn't know who they might be at the time. Anyway, nowadays that work is all done, using computers, but not long ago, seriously, like the mid 80s, the Army and the Navy were still doing this with models on tables. So we kind of keep that heritage alive.
That's really neat. That's kind of like the sand table.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Like the sand table. We were talking to one retired colonel, and that was his first question when we started talking about what we were doing. He says, "You guys still use sand tables?"
And so the military does not use sand tables anymore. This is all computer generated now.
Oh, how the reality is, you can run through a significant number of computer simulations far faster than you can set up soldiers across the table.
Right. And
for them, running the permutations over and over with variations in logistics and weather, that's pretty important. But as a recreation, it's a lot of fun, and you learn a lot about history.
Yeah.
And
The Historical Miniature Gaming Society, their motto is playing games with history.
Exactly.
And these gentlemen and ladies and all ages, they're not playing games. They're really investigating alternative history. And they don't just show up with models. And I mean, these people who are really serious about it have spent decades in doing historical research and just countless hours. And some of these models are just absolutely beautiful. The time and the attention that the guys spend on their miniatures, they're pieces of art.
And I'm going to share your website, the Historical Miniature Gaming Society Pacific Southwest website, with people here so they can learn a little bit more about it. And I'm looking over your website. I see that you're very active. There's a lot that you do. You have a paper competition, historical essay, I should say, competition. And you also have a conference coming up, a kind of a convention, a 2-day weekend event.
Yes, that's October 9th and 10th. At Cal State Fullerton. It's in the Titan Student Union. The information, as we all know, is up on the website. But Fullerton is very close to Anaheim, so it's kind of central to many of the counties in Southern California, and we'll be getting together for some of the Napoleonic battles are scheduled to run 12 hours.
Oh,
Not
wow.
all of them are quite like that, but yes, once they start rolling, everybody wants to see if Napoleon could have done better than he did in the first time.
Yeah. Does Napoleon ever win that battle?
Yeah, it wouldn't have been easy under any circumstances.
Well, that's great. And is there anything else you want people to know about your Historical Miniature Gaming Society, so that they could learn more?
The most important thing to keep in mind is that we are a nationwide organization, and we're just the Pacific Southwest region.
Okay.
There's active regions all over the United States, and if you go to DuckDuckGo or Google and you search for HMGS, you'll come up with a lot of different links to the Chicago area, the Midwest, the East, and the East, Southeast, the Northwest. And so there tends to be groups close to anybody in the continental United States and Hawaii and Alaska.
Is a much bigger and more active group than I ever thought it would be. I'm sharing now the screen of hmgs.org, Historical Miniatures Gaming Society.org. That seems to be the main national organization.
Yes.
Just so interesting. Thank you, Harmon, and thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit about it. And I hope that you'll come on again after the conference on October 9th and 10th and tell us how it went. Maybe share some pictures.
If I could just share one thing, there's a couple of things that are going on at the convention. You mentioned the essay contest. So every year we do an essay contest where we accept essays on historical topics from students of all ages. We have elementary, high school, undergraduate and graduate essays. So we're going to be announcing the winners with the graduate students. There's a cash prize for the elementary and high school students. There's some gift cards that were donated by our corporate sponsors. So that's going to be going on. And then something that everybody could participate in via Zoom is an interaction with Dr. Robert Ballard, who's the Titanic. He's the National Geographic Explorer, discovered the Titanic. So that's just one of the topics he's going to be discussing. The theme of his lecture it's going to be on Saturday morning on October the 9th from 9:30 to 10:30 Pacific time. So that's 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern time. is the subject of that lecture is how his explorations have rewritten history. So how are the things that we think we know about the Titanic, about PT-109, about the wrecks in and around Guadalcanal, the U-boat attack on the United States. I mean, most people don't realize how active German U-boats were during World War II, right on the coast of America. So that's going to be the subject of his lecture. Thank you, Todd, for putting up that material on the website. I'm going to put my email address in the chat if I could. And anybody who wants to participate is welcome. If the lecture is free, if you would, we are a nonprofit as well, and part of our educational outreach, donations are appreciated. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and anybody who wants to, just contact me and I'll get you the Zoom info.
So that's perfect. Okay, so we will let people know also again before October 9th that that this lecture is coming up. Robert Ballard, for those of you who don't know him, is a retired Navy officer and is the world's foremost, I guess you would call him, marine archaeologist or maritime archaeologist. He's the one who goes down and discovers the Titanic, as Jeff said, and does historical research on sunken ships. It's gone all over the world to do it. National Geographic, I mean, you name it, he's done it. And our dream is to get him on our program sometime to talk about how his work has really rewritten history. And we just might be able to do it because we have an inside connection to Robert Ballard.
I've known him my whole life.
He is Jeff's uncle. And we're hoping to leverage our friendship with Jeff to maybe be able to get Robert to join us sometime. I think that would be such a fascinating program. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you, Harmon. Please stay in touch and keep us up to date on how things go.
Absolutely. We'll let you know how it went.
Very good. Very good. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I'd like to now turn to the conversation about the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. And we have Derek Sansone. And I have to say, Derek, I owe you a lot. I owe you a lot. I know you've put a lot of hard work into kind of talking to us about the Moosargon. You've come before to talk about World War I, and you're the one who suggested this program, and you suggested that we do it, this date, because this was, after all, the beginning of this 47-day battle that was the largest in history. 1.2 million American soldiers participated in this single battle. Why don't you, before you share your screen and start your presentation, which will be maybe 25 minutes on the overview of the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, can I ask you what in the world interests you about World War I in this battle in particular?
Well, like I said last time, I consider World War I to be a hole in our history for many different reasons. We know that the Great Depression and World War II cast a great shadow, but the beginning of the rise as America as a global power, it didn't begin in World War II. It began before that in the Spanish-American War, getting territory overseas. We solidified our position globally more in the First World War, and World War I was unprecedented. If at the scale of what our nation accomplished in the amount of time that we did, and but greatly overshadowed by the sacrifices made by our allies. And the Meuse-Argonne was the largest battle in American history in a war that has been largely forgotten.
I said to you before we went live, I hope I'm not repeating myself, that as a history teacher, or somebody who has taught history in the past, I'm kind of embarrassed to say how much I've neglected this battle and the story of the Lost Battalion, and really the story of World War I when I taught American history surveys. And I was quite struck by something that Robert said. And Derek, I will come back to you just momentarily, but Robert, I was very struck by your description of World War I veterans, former doughboys, who came home. They did get some parades, and then shortly after the war, kind of people didn't want to talk to them about it. They were very much kind of forgotten soldiers from the 1920s on. Would you say that's true, Robert?
Oh, definitely. After everybody came home and the parades were done and everything settled down and we started getting beyond that immediate post-war economic dip and things started to get better, that's when everybody decided, you know what, we don't want to hear about it. It was too horrible. It's in the past. Let's just forget about it. And by that time, everybody had realized what the Committee for Public Information had done, how effective the propaganda campaign had been. And a lot of people felt really bad. They felt that they had been taken advantage of by the government.
Yeah.
And that's another aspect of the First World War that fits in real well with it being the first truly modern war, is we started to look at the government a little bit differently after that.
And there was an ambiguous ending to the war with the United States failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, to become a member of the League of Nations. There was a sense that it was there wasn't quite the closure that we had at the end of World War II, say, and it just struck me so much then that meant that we have this whole generation of veterans, so the World War II veterans' fathers in many cases, who very much experienced something similar to, say, what our Korean War vets or Vietnam vets experienced, just being neglected, shunted aside, forgotten.
Well, their goal had been that the horrors of the trenches would never be seen again in their lifetime or their son's lifetime. And that's exactly what happened. And when they went to war 21 years later, all those World War I veterans felt let down. They all stood around going, what did we do it all for? What was the point? And that feeling carried over into the 50s and 60s. When it got time for the 50th anniversary and then the 60th anniversary, these guys didn't want to say anything. And when the Army started to realize that by the 1970s, nobody had asked them anything, they started sending out questionnaires. And some of the doughboys filled them out and sent them back. Other doughboys wrote a short 2-word answer across the front of it and sent it back. And by and large, it was too late by then. You know, a lot of them were gone or just didn't care anymore because they'd seen too much now. But they'd gone through the First World War. They'd gone through the Depression. They had seen a Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. And they realized everything they'd done was for absolutely nothing. In the end, when you look at World War I, it was a pointless war, and it solved absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it really, and it set up lots of bad things around the world. You know, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Great Depression, the collapse of several empires, and then the rise of fascism in World War II. So Derek, why don't you give us an overview of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne? And you people here might notice that you're feeling a little bit under the weather. It is not COVID. You did get tested, but it is a bad cold or something like that, right?
Yes. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Derek Sansone, and it's great to be back on the BBC. And yes, pardon me, I am at the end of fighting a wicked cold, so my voice is not 100%. But a few things before I start. Another thing to bear with me on is that my pronunciation of French and German names is not great, so please bear with me on that. And throughout the presentation, you're going to hear some names and division numbers. I'll ask you to think of them as characters in this big story, but in the time we have, I can't mention everyone. And lastly, this presentation is not about glorifying war, but it's about remembering the sacrifices and the accomplishments of a forgotten generation who fought the biggest battle in American history. I'm going to bring up the presentation. Everyone can see it?
Yep.
Okay. Here is the chapel at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in France, which is run by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The cemetery contains 14,246 American graves. The Meuse-Argonne was the principal American engagement of World War I and the deadliest, with just over 26,000 killed and 95,000 wounded in 47 days. A little bit of background. Economic problems had hampered Britain and France's ability to borrow money, and by 1917, the US was vested in the Allies. American ground forces, including the regular army, the National Guard, and the Marines, was roughly 300,000, and Germany had around 140 divisions in the West. When fighting ended in the East, that went up to about 190. The US Army was not a modern army, but they had to quickly provide enough troops to end the stalemate, or there'd be no allies to support. And in early 17, the army was not in a position to do that. Germany gambled it would take the US years to mobilize, and by then they could have won. With history, it's important to understand the time we're studying, and people of their times are difficult to understand now. The Industrial Revolution had ramped up. It was a time of mass immigration into the US. Labor hadn't organized. Women couldn't vote. Cars didn't go over 30 miles an hour, and horses and carriages were still common. Many of the senior officers were sons of Civil War vets, and themselves veterans of the Spanish-American War and the Philippines. Some of them grew up in the South at the end of Reconstruction. These men came up in a time of cavalry charges in colorful uniforms. Some of the junior officers and NCOs were vets of the expedition to Mexico against Pancho Villa, and some were being trained in modern staff planning techniques. And while these experiences provided some lessons, the Army was not up to the type of war that had waged in Europe. By 1918, more than 1 million US troops were over there. It was an amazing mobilization, but training was rushed and the EAF was not ready by the spring. Pershing was under tremendous pressure to plug troops into the line under British and French command. Up to now, Foch lacked the authority to issue orders in his own name, and US policy was American troops under American command. Russia's withdrawal relieved the Central Powers from a two-front war. General Erich Ludendorff knew Germany must win in 1918 or face defeat. Experienced divisions moved west, and huge breakthroughs caused retreats up and down the front. Paris was in jeopardy, and it was time for the AAF to act. Foch was starting to set overall strategy and getting the Allies fighting as a coordinated force with the AAF fully engaged. With American help, the spring offensive was stopped at Cantigny, Chateau Thierry, Belleau Wood, the Marne, and Soissons. In each case, they made mistakes, but showed a willingness to fight hard and learn. In each case, they gained respect of Allies and Germans. Now, High Command envisioned a grand offensive along a broad front. In the summer of 18, the Germans had fallen back to the Hindenburg Line, and this was the position of the line on September 26. Now, I know there's a lot here, and most have seen Western Front maps, but what I want everyone to notice is the sectors: Belgian, British, French, and American. This is the Saint Mihiel area, and this is the Meuse-Argonne running between Sedan and Verdun. The Meuse-Argonne was one of a series of attacks along the entire Western Front. It also involved French and French colonial troops. Turning the tide at Second Marne, along with a steady buildup of doughboys, gave Pershing his chance. The First Army he'd been pushing for became operational on 10 August. Pershing commanded, and Hugh Drum, as in Fort Drum, was chief of staff. With the Germans now retreating in orderly fashion, Foch wanted to keep up the pressure. Foch again pressed Pershing to mix his troops. Pershing again refused. And in what's been recorded by history as a heated exchange, Foch asked, "Do you want a part in the coming battle?" And General Pershing's answer is right here at the bottom. The St. Mihiel salient was created in 14, fortified in 15, and held since. There were enough U.S. troops to flatten it, about 500,000 in First Army, and success was critical, as it was the first battle planned and commanded by Americans, where both the AF and Pershing would prove themselves. On September 2nd, Foch agreed that the AF could go ahead with limited objectives. As soon as it was flattened, First Army would take over a 24-mile sector along the Meuse River and Argonne Forest. And St. Mihiel brought together the largest number of Allied aircraft into one area during the entire war. With St. Mihiel cleared, Chief of Staff Drum gave Colonel George Marshall the job to plan the shift of troops out of St. Mihiel on heavily damaged roads to the Meuse-Argonne. This required all of Marshall's movement and staff experience, and something uniquely American, the ability to throw the book away when crisis or common sense demanded. Staff had 2 weeks to plan for what would be the largest battle ever fought by an American army, but grew confident from reports that many German divisions were as much as half under strength. Americans were also relieving about 200,000 French and Italians who had to be moved out over the same roads. So artillery, air service, all of the units swelled the number to be moved out to about 600,000. And as St. Mihiel line infantry couldn't be pulled out and refitted in time, 15 fresh divisions had to be moved across the rear of the attacking army. And this was a difficult maneuver, especially when the movements had to take place at night and without lights. It was a problem that would have taxed the most seasoned staff. Some 4,000 guns and 40,000 tons of artillery ammo had to be moved to the front, and over 90,000 animals took part in the movement. The Service of Supply established railheads, evac hospitals, supply ammo, fuel, gas warfare, and engineering depots to supply the drive. Now, this was an unprecedented gathering of manpower and firepower, but planning and logistics is half the battle. The offensive was a two-army attack, French 4th on the left, American 1st on the right, to cut the rail lines at Sedan that fed and moved the Germans behind the lines. If cut, the thought was it would force the Germans into the open, giving the Allies an advantage. German artillery was on the heights of the Meuse, Canal, Romane, and Montfaucon. The exposed terrain and uphill advance made surprise impossible, and Pershing's decision to devote most of his veteran divisions to St. Mihiel meant that 5 of the 9 slated for the initial assault had little to no combat exposure. Many didn't believe the AAF was up to the challenges of an offensive on this scale. The area was defended by 3 main defensive belts, each named for a witch from German mythology. The first line was the Etzel-Geisler-Stellung, which included Montfaucon. The strongest troops weren't there, but the position by nature of its terrain was formidable. The second line was the Kriemhild-Stellung. It was the strongest and included Romane and Canal. And to the north was the third line, the Freya-Stellung. No man's land was a trap because the Germans had almost 4 years to fortify it with barbed wire, pillboxes, machine gun nests, etc. So the stage was now set, putting a relatively inexperienced First Army against a section of the Hindenburg Line on good ground and a prime example of defense in depth. On this map, we can clearly see First Army's area of responsibility. First Corps, commanded by General Hunter Liggett, as in Fort Hunter Liggett, primarily in the Argonne Forest. Fifth Corps in the center, commanded by General George Cameron, primary responsibility to take Montfaucon. And Third Corps, under General Robert Lee Ballard, main effort towards the Meuse River and the Canal Heights, and to support Montfaucon, with an element of the 4th Division crossing the Corps boundary. Now, there were about 400 tanks and 600 aircraft to support the attack, and if First Army could sustain momentum, it was thought German reinforcements would not be able to form a cohesive defense. The Germans had almost 40 under strength but uninterested in retreat divisions and reinforced as the battle progressed. First Army and the French also reinforced. Eventually, 25 American divisions were in, representing 2 field armies. Now, the plan was to break the Hindenburg Line in 3 phases. In the 3-hour bombardment prior to the attack, more ordnance was fired than in the Civil War by both sides. Pershing wanted to go 10 miles in 36 hours to seize the high ground before German reinforcements could arrive. At 0530, the 9 divisions were to advance through the first line and take Montfaucon. The French pushed 9 miles. And 1st and 3rd Corps did have significant gains, but the failure to take Montfaucon by 5th Corps' 79th Division overshadowed Day 1. So Pershing's Day 1 miracle to take the strong defenses near Montfaucon and Romans with such green troops was wildly optimistic. But with the attention paid to Montfaucon, Marshall considered the Argonne Forest the hinge of the entire offensive. And we can see down here what General Liggett thought of the Argonne. He called it a natural fortress besides which the Virginia wilderness in which Grant and Lee fought was a park. Now at this point, across the front, First Army had not received adequate artillery support. Artillerymen had difficulty providing responsive fires given poor tactical communications and the fluid and confused nature of the fighting. Americans tried quickly to learn the artillery-infantry coordination it took the Allies years to master. German aviation and massive artillery from the heights of the Meuse took a toll, and German machine gunners were making expert use of the terrain. As the Germans fell back to stronger parts of the Etzel-Geisler line, they booby-trapped yielded positions to make Americans pay for each inch of ground. Now, before I move on, I want everyone to make a quick mental note of General von Gallwitz's words here, because we're going to get back to him in a few minutes. On the 27th, the 79th draftees took Montfaucon, and 2 divisions, including an elite Prussian Guard division, were repulsed by the 35th National Guardsmen, including Harry Truman's field artillery. Elsewhere along the entire front, the Belgians were pushing on Ghent. The Brits, with Canada and New Zealand, broke through at Cambrai. Australians and US Second Corps attacked at the San Quentin Canal. Now, by early October, the advance stalled due to traffic jams bringing up troops and supplies, rain, and Spanish flu spikes. First Army was facing a determined enemy, and Pershing had to get the attack moving so it wouldn't hamper progress along the entire front. So Marshall again swapped out thousands of troops, relieving tired French units with cocky Americans. So seasoned divisions were placed in the center where the push had been slowest, and the AF was to advance to the Roman high ground, to open a route to the Sedan rail junctures. From the 14th to the 17th, a series of assaults caused a domino effect along the Kriemhilde-Stehlang. The Big Red One advanced against 3 Guard divisions. Elements of the 33rd and 29th crossed the Meuse. The 82nd All-American Division took and held Hill 223. And Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur's 42nd Rainbow Division took Côte de Châtillon, creating a gap in the Hindenburg Line. And the French reached the Ance River. Now, by mid-October, First Army had almost 1 million men engaged, but over 12,000 doughboys had been killed since the 26th. And it took 3 weeks to reach the objective Pershing set for day 1, piercing the Kriemhilde-Stehlang. But by the end of October, the Argonne Forest had been cleared. Elsewhere along the front, the U.S. Marines were causing a world of hurt in the Champagne region. Billy Mitchell's Air Service bombed airfields, command posts, supply and rail depots, downed observation balloons, and conducted recon and pursuit operations. It was during this phase the Lost Battalion affair occurred, and Elvin York captured 132 prisoners. And while there was progress, the push again bogged down due to troop exhaustion, high casualties, and more traffic jams in the rear. Recognizing he was not up to commanding the AF and First Army simultaneously, Pershing promoted himself out of direct operational command. In the second week of October, First Army was turned over to Hunter Liggett, and Second Army stood up with Robert Lee Bullard commanding. Now, General Liggett was Marshall's boss in the Philippines and moved Marshall up to First Army Chief of Operations. Liggett thought Pershing's emphasis on individual marksmanship and open warfare was outdated and issued orders to bypass strong points that were holding up the advance. He also favored short advances to keep infantry within range of artillery support. And it was at this point that divisional boundaries were no longer no trespass signs. Now, Folk and Pershing were now optimistic and ordered a hard push. Objectives were not limited, and they only wanted the troops to know the direction of the attack and advance as far as possible. But convoys were still struggling to move up vast amounts of supplies and ammo, and about 175,000 sick and wounded had to be evacuated on jammed roads. But successful Allied attacks were taking place on other parts of the front, and in the last week of October, over 1,500 artillery tubes were at the front, including 14-inch railroad guns manned by crews from the world's finest Navy. Army engineers built roads, rail lines, and supply routes throughout the sector. But by this point, the campaign had gotten really nasty. 41 tons of mustard gas was dropped on Burgoyne, which displaced or destroyed 9 German artillery batteries. And fake surrendering to draw out Americans and fire while hidden caused many units to just stop taking prisoners. Now, remember those guns I mentioned just a second ago? Roughly 1 gun per 20 meters was at the front, and each fired an average of 235 shells per day. Now, those guns just shredded what little was left of the German lines at this point. The air service strafed and bombed in an early example of air-ground coordination. The 3-division smash was led by the 2nd Division and its Marine Brigade, the 2nd, the 89th, and the tough hombres of Texas and Oklahoma's 90th Division attack at Barracourt finally put First Army within artillery range of Sedan. The Germans abandoned the Freya Stehlang in a fighting withdrawal, and despite heavy fire from the heights, Liggett ordered all units to cross the Meuse at all points along the front, while Pershing ordered a general pursuit without regard for fixed objectives and without fear of their flanks. So the increasing number of German POWs was showing that the tide was turning here. The weight of American divisions, combined with improving tactical ability, was starting to show. And while the Germans were reaching the end of their manpower, they were still using every resource to strike hard. But at the end, Pershing orders 1st and 2nd Army to press attacks with maximum force and to not let up until the moment the armistice went into effect. The 77th Liberty Division pushed 12 miles, exacting some revenge for the Lost Battalion. MacArthur's 42nd Rainbow Division pushed another 10. The Big Red One began its controversial race to Sedan. The Red Devils of the 5th Division pushed 11 miles past the Meuse, and the French entered the outskirts of Sedan. Now, remember General von Gallwitz a little while ago? This is what he had to say now. I don't know if any of this is blocked, but he said all frontline commanders report the troops are fighting courageously, but just cannot do anything. A little bit more about Colonel George C. Marshall, sort of the star of this presentation. As a member of and later 1st Army Chief of Ops, he had a role in planning and supervising the movement and commitment of more troops in battle than any American officer would again achieve until General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group in France, 1944. Now this campaign map shows where divisions operated and is at the National World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice ended the fighting. The U.S. was committed to industrial age warfare before it was ready and learned painful lessons. Despite losses and challenges, doughboys proved they were capable of waging modern war. In the 47 days, Americans pushed the front back considerably and caused the Germans to commit 46 divisions in the area. In the process, Americans inflicted about 100,000 casualties and captured over 26,000 enemy prisoners. As Ludendorff feared, fresh and determined Americans had turned the tide. But the casualty rate gave the Meuse-Argonne the distinction of being the costliest campaign in American history. And we'll close with some of General Pershing's words in regards to his troops. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. I know that was a lightning fast overview. I hope everyone found it interesting and informative and now understand a little bit about why I feel the largest battle in American history should be remembered. Thank you, Todd, for again having me as a guest, and we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was absolutely wonderful, in-depth, and very fast, but very in-depth. You know, my understanding is, before we go to Robert, we may have some questions for you specifically about the Moosargon. My understanding has always been that the Germans were essentially finished by early August 1918, but the generals simply could not surrender. They simply could not. They had to find a way to be able to pass the surrender on to civilian authorities in Berlin. And the problem was it was pretty much a military dictatorship. The country of Germany was pretty much a military dictatorship at that time. So they fought on, even though the situation in Germany, in Berlin, was deteriorating rapidly. You had a population, urban populations living on 500 calories a day. You had easily 500,000 Germans starving to death in the summer of 1918. The government of Germany had essentially ceased to function in a meaningful way, and Pershing wanted to press on to Berlin. That's what Pershing did not anticipate, a German collapse so quickly. He thought, and this is all American war planners and all the allies, I would imagine, thought that World War I, when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the projection was that this war, which was stalemated in the trenches, neither side budging, two sides perfectly balanced, that this war is going to go on until 1920, 1921, maybe 1922. And so the US was going to have a lot of time to prepare and train up for the final battle that would tip the scales and bring the Allies victory. And it didn't happen that way. The Germans collapsed more quickly than anybody anticipated. And on the eve of the Meuse-Argonne, there's a rush to get Americans into the battle before it's all over, right? 10,000 arriving a day, 10,000 Americans arriving on France's shores a day to get involved in the fighting. And this is all a stem winder to say that my understanding is that on November 11th, Pershing really did press to grab as much territory as possible. And it was quite a costly morning, November 11th to 11 a.m. Thousands, tens of thousands wounded, thousands killed. Is that what your understanding also, Derek?
That's my understanding. There's probably a couple people on the line that can speak more eloquently to that, but I am of the opinion that towards the end, and it's just my opinion, that Germany and the United States were kind of fighting for the same thing toward the end, and that was to get a bigger piece at the bigger chair at the peace conferences and get better terms, especially Germany. Ludendorff knew this going in. But yes, I've heard that Pershing wanted to go all the way to Berlin, and Pershing and Foch, from my limited reading, had a contentious relationship, but Pershing was kind of close to Pétain, I believe, and had that come to Jesus moment with Pétain, explaining to him that how hard did the Germans fight to hang on to French soil that they had taken? How many American troops are you willing to lose? How hard are the Germans going to fight when they're on their own territory? And look at what the Allies had gone through at that point. And I think it's a legitimate criticism. We know that the British consider the United States a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys, and that maybe the United States didn't completely appreciate what the Allies had gone through. But I'm of the opinion, and it's just my opinion, that with Russia coming out of the war and Germany having some numerical superiority in the West for the first time, that the Allies could not do what they were doing and what 1.2 million Americans were doing. And General Patton said that no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. Yes, the U.S. Army was not ready in the spring when all hell broke loose with the offensive, but they had to get into the fight. I've read that the U.S. was building more toward having a huge army ready for a 1919 campaign than a mid-size army ready for 1918. And with the experiences of the Meuse-Argonne and Saint-Mihiel, I think there's a good question there. What kind of an army would the U.S. have brought to 1919 if that would have happened? But those are answers we'll never know.
We'll never know. My understanding also, I think 4 million ended up serving in uniform during World War I. Only 2 million got overseas. There was a kind of sense that we weren't quite ready for the end of that war. Robert Laplander, thank you for sitting so patiently. Robert is a historian, an expert on the Lost Battalion, which he'll be telling us about. Such an important episode of the Moosargon. And you're also, I understand, a Marine.
That was a long time ago in a far off distant land.
When were you in the Marine Corps?
In the mid 80s. This is what I asked at our breakfast on Friday morning to somebody. Why would such a nice smart person like you join the Marine Corps? It was a desire to be the best. And I originally wanted to fly. I wanted to join the Air Force, but I had glasses, so they wouldn't let me fly. So I said, well, if I can't fly, I'm not going to join. I'll go do something better, and I'll go be a machine gunner. And well, I don't know if that was better. I don't know if it was a wise decision. I know that my mother told me years later, she said, the whole time you were gone, I had one prayer. God, you know he's stupid. Just keep him doing anything else stupider.
And Robert, is your Marine Corps service feed into your, I'll call it an obsession with World War I? I mean, you've dug into the Lost Battalion like nobody else in the world has.
No, my time in the service had nothing to do with it. It was two different worlds. Studying the First World War, to understand the First World War is to understand the 20th century. Everything that happened after it happened because of it. And to understand attitudes and the United States Army was born. The modern United States Army was born in the Meuse-Argonne. We went into that battle as teenagers. We came out as adults. That 47 days made all the difference. And the 19 months that we spent in that war really showed America what America could do, and it showed the country or the world what America could do. When we got into the war, we stood 17th in the size of our army. By the end of the war, we were the preeminent power in the world, though we wouldn't realize that for another 21 years. But our army expanded in that 19 months by 1,700%. And not only did we raise, train, equip, and ship over an entire army, we also had to build a complete infrastructure in the United States for them. And then we had to build a complete infrastructure overseas for them. So there were 4.7 million men that served in uniform by December of 1918. We put 2.2 million of them overseas. That is an incredible achievement for a country that had never done anything like that before. We went from not knowing anything about modern warfare to knowing everything there was to know at the end. It took the Allies, the French and the British, 3.5 years to get to where we were in 47 days at the end of the Meuse-Argonne. We paid a heavy price. We paid a huge price for it. But when 1917 broke, few people realized that the French and the British had each come up with a date that they had planned to sue the Germans for peace, because they knew that they couldn't continue the war indefinitely. And they knew that if the United States did not come in and lend a hand, they couldn't perpetrate the war. So when the United States, it was kind of a godsend when the United States declared war. And the British made sure that we got a copy of the Zimmermann telegram. Even though we had intercepted it on our own, they made sure we got a copy too. And the unrestricted submarine warfare that started in February and lasted up until our declaration was no joke. The Germans knew that they had to sink, I think it was 40,000 tons a month so that they could win the war. And in February, they came close to it. And in March, they exceeded it. And they were having their way with everything that we were doing, everything that we were sending over. So there was a legitimate gripe. We actually had a legitimate gripe. So, and then you advance forward and you think about what we were intending to do. Yes, that war was intended to go into 1920. Everybody believed it would. Nobody believed the Germans were going to collapse when they did. And that's part of what happened on November 11th. There had already been 2 times that the Germans had brokered for peace, and the word had gotten around that the Germans were going to give up. And so we slacked off a little bit. When the announcement was made that the armistice would be signed at 11 a.m. on November 11th, nobody believed it. Certainly not the Allied High Command, certainly not the American High Command. And Pershing was determined that we are going to keep the pressure on, and they are going to surrender. We're not going to let them off the hook. And that's why they continued that war right up until the last minute. They pushed right up until the last minute to make sure that Germany was going to do what Germany said they would do. Nobody trusted them. Nobody believed in them. So there's been a lot of contention in the last 20 years about that last day, how it was a waste and stuff. Every day of a war is a waste. And I've often thought that the first and the last casualty of every war was the biggest waste. Nevertheless, without keeping the pressure on, there is every possibility that Germany wouldn't have thrown in the towel. Germany's army was not beat. The politicians were beat. The civilians were beat. The blockade had kept them from getting anything that they needed. And there were people starving in the streets while the army still had food. Not a lot of it, and they didn't have the best uniforms, but they did have what they needed. The government made sure that the Germans in the field were supplied, and they weren't whipped by any stretch of the imagination. They marched back across the Rhine and into Germany in good order, flying their flags and their pinions, and they demobilized themselves. The Americans didn't have to do it. The French didn't have to do it. The British didn't have to do it. They did it themselves. And then the country collapsed into chaos. And by the time they signed the final peace in 22, everybody knew that this wasn't the end. There couldn't possibly be an end with the peace that they had signed. If you read the Versailles Treaty, you just shake your head and go, how could they do this? This guarantees another war. Case in point, they signed the final peace in 22. By 23, Hitler's already banging the drum. So it was almost foreordained that there would be another war, though everybody wanted to believe otherwise. The Meuse-Argonne itself, what it means to America, is kind of lost in the titanic battles of World War II. But if this was the 20s or 30s, we would all be on the same page. We would all know Argonne. Argonne meant everything. And it would send a ripple of fear up the spines of many of the men that had served in that area, even if they weren't in the Argonne forest. It was common for everybody to say they served up in the Argonne. Well, they meant the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It was a 22-kilometer front that went from the Meuse River in the east over to the Argonne forest in the west. Truth be told, they weren't supposed to take that forest. Pershing's 72-hour time frame for breaking through the Grimaldi-Stillong and making it up to the Freya did not include actually taking the forest and forest. For centuries, armies have fought around it. And if you've ever been in there and seen that forest, you'll understand why they didn't want to get in there. It's almost primeval in the way that forest is put together. It's unbelievable how thick it is. There's parts of the forest in the summertime when the trees are leafed out, the sun never touches the ground. There's areas in there you can't see more than 10 or 12 feet in any direction. To try to move through this, they could not move a picket line through. They had to advance in squad columns and sometimes section columns. It was insane to try to push through this. The idea was that the French would go up the Aire River or the Aisne River Valley on the left of the forest, and the 28th Division, which was stationed off to the right of the 77th, had been split in two by the Aire River. And one brigade was actually buried in the forest, and the other brigade was on the other side of the river. The 77th Division, which pushed against the bottom of the forest, was only supposed to push against what was thought would be a retreating enemy. If the enemy didn't retreat, then the 4th Army on the left and the 28th on the right would pinch them off. They were going to meet at Grand Pre above. And if the Germans didn't retreat, they would be boxed in and all captured. If they did retreat, they'd have to give up the line. Now, if you'll notice that second black line that's just above the initial jump off line, notice how it dips down into the forest. Now, if you were to continue that to the left into the French army sector, it would go up. And this is what the Argonne Forest meant. By the time the 72-hour time frame fell apart, and Pershing ordered them to go in and clear out the forest, they had to push the forest clear. The 77th began operations in a serious way. This happened more on the 28th. By that time, they had gotten far enough into the forest where the Germans were beginning to pull back. They were going to, they thought, abandon the Gazelle-Stillong and pull back to the Grimaldi. When they realized that they didn't have to in the Argonne forest, They got back into the Gisela Stallung, and they set up defensive operations that really stymied everybody. Now, the reason for this is because the Argonne Force, there are actually two pre-positions that were in the Argonne Force, the Hagenstellung and the Hagen Nord. The Hagenstellung is classic World War I battlefield. It's all devastation. The forest was tore apart. There was nothing there, collapsed trenches. The Germans actually held that line very, very lightly. The Hagen Nord was a different story. The North Hagenstellung was a pre-sighted artillery target, and they had hundreds of machine guns buried in there. If the enemy made it past the Hagen, the idea was they would never make it through the Hagen Nord up to the main Gesellerstellung line. Whittlesey's forces and the 77th actually did push up to that line. They were trapped for a short period of time just in front of that line on a hill called Loam Moor, Hill of the Dead Man. It's outside of a mill. For about a little over 48 hours, 400 men were boxed into a small area. The Germans were in the midst of a pullback, and they never realized exactly the beautiful position that they had, Whittlesey and his men, in out on that hillside. Had they realized it, they could have easily destroyed them. The Germans pulled back without realizing, but Whittlesey had realized what had happened. And when they moved forward 3 more kilometers, they actually managed to get through the Gesellerstellung, across the top of the hill and into the Charleville Ravine.
I'm going to interrupt you, Robert, just so that we could, so that some of our viewers who might not be familiar with the story of the Lost Battalion can understand a little bit of it. These are men from the 308th Battalion,
308th Infantry Regiment
of the 77th Infantry Division,
yeah,
led by a Major Charles Whittlesey.
Major Charles Whittlesey was the commander of the 1st Battalion. There were 3 battalions in a regiment at that time. And if you look at the line where the 77th was, there were 4 infantry regiments in a division, and the 77th had all 4 of their regiments in line, 308, 307, 306, and 305. And on the far left was the 308th. They had stacked the battalions, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And the 1st Battalion had pushed in. They were the ones that were taking the majority of the fire. By the time they got in 2 or 3 days into the battle, they realized that the only way that they were going to be able to clear that forest would be to actually, push the 2nd Battalion in and merge them with the 1st. They were losing men at a tremendous rate. By the time they got up to the Charleville Ravine on October 1st, most of the units were down by half strength already. And we went from having 240 men in a company to having 100, maybe less than 100 at times. These are tremendous casualties in an absolutely horrendous forest. At the same time, they're fighting the weather. It had started to rain on September 18th, and it had rarely stopped since then. The temperature remained unrelentingly low. They were fighting in an area that the Germans had been ensconced for 4 years. The line had gone static in 1916, so the Germans had made a city inside the forest.
That was stunning to me when I read that you had written that the Germans had spent so much time and so much great concrete building a city that included things like swimming pools, housing, barracks. I mean, they were absolutely ensconced there and very hard to find and very hard to penetrate.
They were there for the long haul. They weren't going anywhere. It's a beautiful forest. The Argonne is an absolutely gorgeous forest. And the Germans took advantage of it. They used it as a rest area for their men. That did not mean that they were not prepared for anything. The French had tried to take that force back in 1914, 1915, and 1916, and had lost 120,000 men there themselves before they decided, you know what, we're not going to do this. Let's just keep it quiet. And here you see other elements in the Argonne forest. The Germans weren't fooling around. They were there for the long haul, and every inch of that forest was a defensive perimeter. miles and miles of barbed wire. You go out there today, we've been in places in the Argonne Forest nobody's been since the war. There's still barbed wire. There was a full narrow gauge rail system out there, concrete pillboxes, machine gun nests, trenches, crawl trenches. There was a complete telephone system out there, hot and cold running water, electricity. They had everything they needed.
And so you've gone out there personally and to investigate the sites of the Lost Battalion.
Oh yeah. We made our first trip over in 2000, and I've been over there 8 or 9 times since. The last time we were there was in 2018 for the 100th anniversary of the event. I was there with the Center for Military History as one of their tour leaders. We brought current serving soldiers over there. And for the first time since 1918, we brought 77th soldiers and put them on that hillside.
Oh, how wonderful.
It was very amazing. We've brought survivors' relatives over there and put them down in that ravine and explained what their relative went through. Here you can see a tremendous map. This is the ABMC location of where the Lost Battalion was. They were in an ellipsis dug into the side of a hill that ran about 300 yards by about 100 yards. And into that ellipsis, they packed about 700 men. Now that's a lot of flesh in a small area. Fortunately, they were dug into the south side of the hill, so the German artillery fire from the north couldn't really hit them. But there were trench mortars behind them, and there were plenty of machine guns that were coming in on them. When they entered that ravine on the afternoon and evening of October 2nd, 1918, they all did so with foreboding, particularly Whittlesey, who was in charge. He had tried 3 times to get the orders changed because he knew if they got in that ravine, they were going to get surrounded. He knew that the flanks weren't going to be able to keep up with them. The fire was too heavy. And it was a very specific set of circumstances that put them in that ravine in the first place. And they sat there for 5 days and just got the crap kicked out of them by the Germans. Within the first 48 hours, they had 62% casualties.
62% casualty in the first 48 hours. Can you tell us what the conditions were like? I know it wasn't just surviving the firepower, it was also starvation, water, lack of medicine, correct?
Yeah, they had gone in the entire battle. When they went in, the battle was supposed to last 72 hours. So they weren't really supplied for a long time battle as far as food and water went. And when the battle extended beyond that, First Army had a hard time bringing food up into that forest. It was an absolutely atrocious place to be. And there were very few roads that cut through the Argonne Forest at the time. There's very few that cut through it now, particularly north to south. There's a couple of roads that pass east to west, but virtually none north to south. They had to take German rail lines to be able to move things in that forest. And that included food. So when these guys landed in the Charleville Ravine on the evening of October 2nd, they had virtually no food. They had virtually no medical supplies. As a matter of fact, by noon of the first day on the 3rd, they were out of medical supplies. The only water to be had was at a stream at the foot of the hill, but it was under such heavy fire from the Germans. They could only go down there at night. They had to be very careful. They lost a number of men trying to get water until Whittlesey had decided to put a guard up to keep men from going down there. By the 3rd day, these guys were buried on that hillside. These are actual Army photographs of what it looked like at the end of the siege. The German fire had torn off so much of the cover that they had to dig in far deeper than they thought they would. And they couldn't get out of their holes. By the 3rd day, nobody was getting out of their holes. So they did everything they had to do in their holes, and that means everything. They were starving. Many of them were sick. The flu was going around, pleurisy. They had problems with their feet from not being able to get up and move around. Circulation was becoming a problem. They had no overcoats. They had no shelter halves. They had no blankets. You couldn't light a fire. That part in the movie always drives me crazy because you didn't light a fire at the front. That's just insane. The 3 medics that were in there were actually 5 at the beginning. 1 was captured, 1 was wounded. The other 3 did everything they could to try to keep these guys together. It was a losing proposition. You know, by noon of the first day, they were out of medical supplies. There was nothing they could do for these guys. They were reusing bandages from the dead. Nobody had the strength to bury the dead anymore, so they were piling them in a low wall in front of the area where they had the wounded laid out to try to protect them from some of the fire. There were dead bodies and parts of bodies all over the place. It was just a horrible place to be. The worst came on October 4th in the afternoon. There was an artillery officer in there with him by the name of John Teichmuller. And Lieutenant Teichmuller was in just as bad a shape as everybody else was. And he decided that what they needed was some artillery support. And he had sent a message back via pigeon. They had pigeons in there with them. And that message, in that, he had transposed 2 of the numbers in the coordinates. So the artillery fire that came in that afternoon actually didn't fall behind them. It fell on top of them. So for about 2 hours, they were bombed by their own artillery. And it was during that artillery brush that Whittlesey's famous letter that was sent out by pigeon, Cherami, the pigeon, went out that said, "We're along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." And they sent Cherami out. Cherami wound up 22 minutes later landing at the mobile loft that he was based from. He was missing a leg, he was missing an eye, and he had a big hole in his chest. Truth be told, that's not what stopped the artillery. There was a artillery observer behind the lines that
Don't ruin that story for me, Robert.
I know that's the best part of the story. And when I tell the story live on stage, that's the one where everybody's, they're like this. Oh. The truth of the matter is that Cherami did not stop the artillery, but there was nobody in the Lost Battalion that you could convince otherwise of. Right till the day they all died. They all were convinced that Cherami had stopped that artillery barrage. By the time it did stop, though, the damage had already been done. There were 80 wounded and 30 killed by their own fire. The next day, the Germans launched a major attack that hit from all sides, and they managed to beat it off. But by that time, there were only 2 machine guns left out of the 9 that had come in. There were only 2 left. On the 6th, the Air Corps got involved and tried to drop supplies to them. This would have been the first attempted major aerial resupply in history. Unfortunately, from the air, one section of the forest pretty much looks like the other section of the forest. And these guys realized that if they could be seen from the air, then they could be seen from the hills around them. And that would mean that the Germans would kill them. So the flyers couldn't see them, and they couldn't drop the supplies where they needed to be. And as a matter of fact, all of the supplies that they dropped wound up in German hands. And the Germans would open the boxes and call down the hill and tell them what was in the boxes. "Hey, there's medicine in here. You guys hurting? You need something? Come on over. We've got plenty now. Food, ammunition." And these guys sat there. And the ones who could speak German would holler back. And there was a lot of back and forth going in there between the German speakers, and then the English speakers among the Germans would holler down. And it's typical soldier talk. There were a lot of 2-word phrases, a lot of single syllable words that went back and forth, a lot of instruction on what the Germans could do, how they could do it, where they could do it, and with what. And then the Germans hit that afternoon of the 6th with 2 flamethrowers. They came in on the right flank. A soldier came running off the right flank and screaming that the the flamethrowers were there, and Whittlesey said, "Liquid fire, hell, you turn around, get your ass back there and fight." They managed to fight them off, but what happened during that battle, that on the 6th, was something that really stuck with everybody, because it was almost like a controlled riot. They had come to the point by then where nobody cared anymore. They were all convinced they weren't going to get out of that ravine. And if they were going to lose that hillside, then they were going to sell it as dearly as possible. They actually got up out of their holes and chased the Germans off. And it was the next day that the major event of the whole 5-day thing came about, when 9 men from the left flank snuck out to try to find one of those boxes of supplies, and they were ambushed. 5 were killed and 4 were wounded and captured. And the one who was wounded the least was a fella named Lowell Hollingshead from Mount Sterling, Ohio. They sent him back in with a surrender letter, and he presented to Whittlesey, and Whittlesey chewed him out for deserting his position, which is pretty much what he did. Then he read the letter and he handed it to McMurtry, George McMurtry, his second in command. McMurtry read it, and he had already been shot in the knee, and he had a shoulder wound, and he straightened up in the hole, and he says, "We got him licked. Otherwise they wouldn't have sent this." And they presented it to a captain who was in charge of the right flank by the name of Nelson Holderman, who would go on to win the Medal of Honor there. And Holderman read it and smiled. And he says, yeah. He says, they're on their last leg. What do you think we ought to do? And Whittlesey ordered that the battalion signal panels that you lay on the ground to alert the aircraft be taken in. Nothing white was to be shown. He told everybody to fix bayonets, that what was coming was probably going to be the final battle. But when word got around on the hillside that the Germans had asked them to surrender, rather than giving up, the doughboys got mad. And if there had been hollering back and forth before, that was nothing compared to what they were telling the Germans to do now. And at about 6:30 that evening, the Germans hit them with everything they had. This time there were 5 flamethrowers. And the doughboys got up and they did it again. And they pushed them out, and they killed all 5 of the men with the flamethrowers. They managed to chase the Germans off. By that time, the Germans had evacuation orders for the Argonne forest. Remember, I said that the forest, that the line had bent down into the forest. Well, off to the right, in the east, where the 28th Division was fighting, the 82nd had brought in 1 brigade of men and was fighting above the 28th, between the 28th and the 1st. The 1st had been brought in to replace the 35th Division, which had been torn apart. They were struggling as well. So they brought this brigade of the 82nd in, and the 82nd pushed up between the 1st and the 35th and went directly west into the forest. And they were breaking the line on the right. You can see there above Varennes. You can see that the arrows where they're pushing into the side of the forest near Apremont. Yep, right there. They actually pushed into the side of the forest. The French had gotten up to a place called Lancon, which was about level with Apremont, but farther to the west. You can't see it on the map. And the Germans realized that they were going to get pinched out into this forest if they didn't pull out. So they decided to pull out and pull back to the Grimaldi. And it was during that push of the 82nd off to the right, the day after they relieved the Lost Battalion, that Sergeant York did his famous deed, which many people are about to find out he didn't do on his own. And about this time next year, there will be a new book out that is going to be very revealing. I didn't write it, so, you know. But on the 7th, that evening, after they managed to beat off the final attack, they could hear the Germans moving in the forest around them. And everybody thought that they were preparing for one more attack. And everybody knew that if the Germans attacked one more time, that they couldn't hold out, that the Germans were going to walk right across that hillside. Truth was that the Germans were actually pulling out. And what they heard in the bushes around them was the Americans, the doughboys of the 307th Infantry Regiment coming up on their right to relieve them. They were led by a lieutenant named Fred Tillman, and Tillman later said that they could smell them a quarter mile away. The guys that were with him that relieved the Lost Battalion walked onto that hillside and then walked back off vomiting. These are hardened combat veterans. They'd never seen anything like that. It looked like a slaughterhouse. And they said that the worst was the shocky yellow-toothed grin that these guys were giving them. They said it was scary. They didn't look like human beings anymore. The next day, when they marched out of that ravine, of the 697 that had gone in, 194 managed to walk out. That's a casualty rate of 72% in 5 days. The reason that the line actually broke in the Argonne was because Whittlesey stayed put. When they went in on the second, his second in command, McMurtry, had told him, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think we should be in here at all because this isn't going to go well. And Whittlesey said, I agree with you, but those are the orders. And Whittlesey stayed put. The next morning, when Nelson Holderman brought in one company from the 307th on the right, he said the same thing. He said, I don't think this is a good idea at all. And Whittlesey said, those are our orders and we will stay put. And it's because he stayed put and it necessitated the rest of the line to try to catch up to him before he was annihilated, that they actually broke that line in the forest. The line everywhere else in the Meuse-Argonne district was already breaking free, but not in the forest. It was because they had to go after him. And the reason that they had to go after him is because they were already writing stories about these guys back at home.
This was a big story in the US.
Yeah.
People were following it.
People were following him. And had Whittlesey's unit been wiped out, it would have been a public relations nightmare for the Army. It would have been just terrible press, and they couldn't afford that. Pershing couldn't afford that. The Meuse-Argonne battle was not going like they had expected. It was taking longer than they thought. Pershing's expectations had been wildly overestimated. There was no way that they were going to do what he was saying they would do in 72 hours. It couldn't be done.
Can you tell us a little bit about this man, Charles Whittlesey, who received the Medal of Honor for his action in the Argonne Forest?
Well, Whittlesey was born in Florence, Wisconsin. It's a little town about 14 miles from the Michigan border, the upper peninsula Michigan border. I was just up there last weekend. He lived in Wisconsin until he was 13. His family was from out east, so they had moved back out east. He grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts then, graduated Pittsfield High School, went to Williams College, which was a prep college, graduated Harvard Law. He was a lawyer in New York City, became involved with the Plattsburgh training program, officer training program before the war. He was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, but he also was a patriot. And he understood that the military had their place. He understood that America had to be taken care of. He was not a combat commander. He was not a combat officer. They had put him in charge of the headquarters company because he was a paper pusher. He got the job as 1st Battalion commander just before the Meuse-Argonne because he was next in line. By and large, he did a fabulous job. After the war, when he was awarded the Medal of Honor, he was the first man in the First World War to get it. On Christmas Eve, 1918. It wasn't awarded for any one thing that he did. It was for his leadership abilities and for what his unit had done. It was representative of his unit. The problem was that Whittlesey had been gassed that summer when they had fought on the Belle and was suffering from the after effects of that. It was commonly known as gas-related tuberculosis at the time. You have to remember that tuberculosis was the #1 killer in America in the 1920s. So any respiratory failure problem was liable to be called tuberculosis. And he was suffering terribly from PTSD. They wouldn't leave him alone after the war. He was one of the 3 great heroes. Pershing had named Charles Whittlesey Sam Woodfill and Alvin York as the three great heroes of the war. His former soldiers would come and visit him with hard luck stories, and he apparently couldn't let anybody go without giving them money. But nevertheless, he knew he was dying of lung troubles. He couldn't sleep. He was not a happy person. And the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1921, he had boarded a ship bound for Havana, Cuba, ostensibly to take a vacation, and he jumped off the ship that night.
Oh, wow.
And committed suicide. This year will be the 100th anniversary of his suicide. I've been working on Whittlesey's biography for about 5 years now. It would have been out had not COVID come into the play.
Right.
Right now, I thought I'd share something with you. This is a diary that belonged to Whittlesey's signalman, the guy who carried the signal panels. His name was Jim Larney. I was lent this by the Larney family to transcribe it and photograph it. This was in his pocket the whole time that he was over there, and was in his pocket when he was hit in the pocket where they were trapped. And in here, he kept a complete record of everything that happened in that ravine. They were not supposed to keep diaries at the front, and Whittlesey saw him writing in it and actually told him to keep doing it just in case they didn't get out. Then there would be a record of it. But it's a great treat to be able to take care of this for a little while and to read through it.
It sure is a sacred document. You know, I'm going to invite Leo West and Ida Mae Gower, if they would like, to talk a little bit about their fathers who served in the 28th Infantry Division. And I'm going to show a picture here of George B. West. Leo, this is your father?
Yes.
And he was in the 111th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division. He was in the Argonne Forest. Did he talk about it much?
Not really up until he reached his 80th birthday, I guess. I think he started to talk about things after the program Roots was on. And he wrote a story of the family history, and then started to put out some things about his war service. And his description of what happened, October 3rd is when he was wounded. So this would have been about the same time that the Lost Battalion was starting their ordeal. And he was taking a platoon. No, I'm sorry, just a squad. The platoon was something else. He was taking a squad on a patrol at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they stumbled across a German machine gun nest. They found it before the Germans found them, and they were on a road, and they slid down into a ravine, and they were supposed to get in touch with somebody, and I think it was probably somebody in the 77th. And as they moved along, Dad stepped on a twig, and it cracked. And as soon as that crack went, why the machine gun opened up, and he got hit with a tracer bullet in his left knee, and it put him down immediately. And he was in a ditch, and he had a bunch of cattails or something like that growing around him. And the machine gun was cutting them off about 18 inches above the ground. And he was able to move himself back to where he had left his men. He had gone on ahead a little bit to be the point. And when he got back to them, they bandaged him up, and then they dragged him out, and they got him to an aid station, and eventually to a field hospital by a some kind of a cart or something. An ambulance, he said, was a cart that they had 2 wheels on it. And he spent 3 days laying in the triage. They carried out 3 people one day, 4 people another day. And this guy that was carrying them out said, "Why don't you hurry up? I'm getting tired of seeing you here." And he was waiting for him to die. And eventually a doctor came on and said, "You still here? Well, we'll take care of you now." So they took him in and operated on his leg. And the surgeon was really a nose, ear, and throat specialist. And they thought the leg was getting better. And he went into he got a fever, and they were going to ship him home at that time, but then this was about 3 or 4 weeks after he had the operation. And he got a fever, and eventually they sent him to Vichy to a base hospital. And his left leg then, from then on, was stiff. He couldn't bend his knee. And the wound never healed. When he died at 94, the wound was still open, and it would drain every once in a while. And that was the problem he had when he was in France. When they sent him to Vichy, it was draining, and it would not heal at all. And it took 2 years in a hospital, and after he got back, they put him on the Leviathan eventually, 1919 in March. And they sent him back to the States, and he went from there to Carlisle when it was a military hospital. And he spent 2 years there. That wound was giving him trouble clear up until the day he died, but off and on. It wasn't steady.
Right.
And he got along fine. I mean, I don't know how he did it, but he was able to do almost anything.
And you'll see here, the viewers will see here that he served in the Mexican emergency, as it was called, Pancho Villa, I guess, expedition. He joined in July 4th, 1916, before the U.S. got involved in World War I. And Leo, you have shared his very brief memoir of his service with me, and I would love to publish this, put it at least on our blog let people to read it. Let me ask you, Leo, before we go to Ida May, did he ever give you you joined the Army or were drafted? Did he give you any advice about
stay out of trouble?
Very good.
He always got into trouble. He had a story about going into anyway, they hated the British redcaps who were training them, and they were supposed to go and review and pass and review in front of them after being on the rifle range. And instead of going in that, he went the back way and behind a hedgerow back into town. It was about 1.5 miles away or something. So when he got back, he got chewed out, and then pretty soon they called him in and they said, "Well, congratulations. We don't have any medals to give you, but we're glad you did that because we're tired of those red caps too."
And you mentioned the Leviathan, which is what he came home on. Yeah. And this thing went back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands probably over the course of the war, and probably single-handedly spread more flu because they packed them on that ship so tightly than any other mode of transportation. Ida May, let's see if Ida May, you're with us.
Yeah, Tom, I'm
Hey,
here.
Ida May, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Good. Are you going to be able to get through this here?
I'm going to try.
Okay. Because your father was also in the same regiment that George B.
Yes.
West was in, and this is him, Werner A. Franklin. He died before you really knew him or could talk to him about it.
I was 3 years old and 3 months to the day when he died.
Do you remember him at all?
I remember seeing him 3 different times in the house, but the only time I remember his face was when he was laying in his casket.
Oh. Does the family have any, stories about his service?
I've tried to piece them together. My cousins, I think, knew him better than I did, but they're quite a bit older than I am. I'm the same age as their children. And a few things that my mother had told me about what he had told her. She said he only ever talked about the service one time. He talked about Argonne Forest, how beautiful it was. And the next day, the streams that had been clear were red with blood and bodies, and the trees were bare. And she said that was the only time he ever spoke of it. But he went to different reunions, and she said that he'd get a phone call or call someone on the phone, and they'd sing over the phone to each other. And she said that he would try to sing me to sleep with Mademoiselle from Marmoteers. And she prayed that I wouldn't remember. And then after he died, she prayed I would. So that was my lullaby. Anyway, I understand.
Can you sing a few bars for us, Autumn May?
No. I don't have the voice. And I understand he needed a little bit of scotch before he got real good on those tunes. So
you sent a second picture here. Who are these?
Those are his 2 brothers.
Oh.
And they were all 3 in France at the same time.
Wow.
And they would occasionally write home. And the letters he wrote to his father, of course, sounded a lot different than the ones to his mother. But someone from the newspaper would show up at their house every day, and their letters would be printed in the front page of the paper because there was such little news that they could get from Europe. And I can't imagine she had 3 of her 4 sons in that war at the same time. And miraculously, they all came home. She had been ill quite a bit. And I understand my father had been exposed to mustard gas, but didn't report it because he wanted to get home. And he had respiratory problems, I understand, most of his life. And he died of lung cancer, and his brothers also died of cancer. So anyway, I was told that he too went with Pershing after Poncheville, and that he was on a troop carrier out of Texas, and they sunk, I think, 2 German ships on the way over, and the ship was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland, but close enough that they could get to shore, and then on to France.
I see, I'm looking at the clock here. I know that we're past time, but I want to open it up for people to ask questions of Robert, Derek, Ida May, Leo, or make observations maybe about the war. If they'd like, hey, Caleb, how are you?
Hey, Todd, how are you?
Good.
I don't know if you just want to take up not too much of your time, but I have something I could share with you guys from my family. So I inherited a whole bunch of letters from my grandparents after they passed away. And many years ago, I worked on this book here, typing up some letters for them to be able to read it. And I was curious as they were talking about the Meuse-Argonne to see, I wonder if my ancestor made any mention of that in this first letter dated from November 19th, 1918. My great cousin, however many grades, I'm not sure, Lawrence E. Howe. He was in Company B of the 305th So I'll just read a little short paragraph for you. It says, this beautiful but cold November morning finds me far advanced from the battle-scarred hills in the beautiful valley of the Meuse. It reminds me of the valley below Lock Haven, toward and around Williamsport, just as nice, and scarcely more damage than that, for all the Germans have occupied it so long. So I just thought that was kind of cool that going through his old letters there.
How wonderful. That is a great artifact there. Yes, and I know Robert has to leave. Robert, you have another meeting coming up, huh?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to pull out here. I've got a meeting starting in like 2 minutes that I have to host for the organization that I run called Doughboy MIA. So
That's Doughboy MIA. Can you tell us a little bit about it before you have to run?
Doughboy MIA, we are the only organization in the world that searches for the missing in action U.S. service personnel from World War I. We have 4,423 names on the list. About 1,800 of them are still missing on the battlefield. We're planning our first trip for November to go over and do a recon for 3 sets of remains that we're pretty sure that we can find. So that's what we do. We look for these remains, and then we're trying to work with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. So I want to thank everybody for listening. Please feel free to get a hold of me. If Todd can put up my email address, I have no problem talking with anybody or trading emails. Caleb, I would love to hear more about your relative in the 305th. That would be great. I do collect 77th Division information on all of the guys in the 77th. Those are my boys, my Liberty Warriors. So, but thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night and God bless.
I appreciate it, Robert. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I'm going to put Robert Laplander's email here in the Zoom chat. And I just want to do a final call here for anybody else who, Connor, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to share something for just a little bit because we'll be running out of time soon. As you know, I've interviewed so many World War II veterans, and I've heard some very great stories, but terrible events. One of my veterans is not really comfortable talking about his experiences in World War II and Korea and Vietnam because he's in 97 now, and he's had PTSD for quite a bit. And in World War II, he served as a paratrooper in the 17th Airborne Division. And in Korea, he served in the 3rd Infantry Division as a company commander. And in Vietnam, he served in the Big Red One, the 1st Division, 1st Infantry Division. And his dad was in World War I, but his dad died at a very young age, at the age of 49. So, yeah.
Yeah, what's so striking is how reminiscent of other generations of veterans the World War I veteran story is. That of lingering illness, people not wanting to talk about it, them not sharing much about it, and it just strikes me that it's there are a lot of similarities across the generations, even the generations that are past. Lisa Reffner.
Yeah, something that struck me, I actually will be honest and I admit I don't know enough about World War I. Of course, this has got me wanting to add to my reading list. It's already a mile long. But something that struck me when he was talking about Whittlesey at the end and how he just didn't want to be bothered and people just kept harassing him. I just got done reviewing Flags of Our Fathers that we're going to be showing during our Veterans Week. And it made me think of Ira Hayes because that's something similar to him. I think, after watching it and reading more about him, I feel like if they just would have left him alone, he would have had a much better outcome to his life.
Yeah.
Than being harassed and hounded for, to tell his story that he wasn't comfortable with.
Right. Chris Perolo.
Yeah, Todd, both my grandfathers served in World War I. One of them was stateside, but the other one went overseas to France. And I actually have his discharge papers. as well as a group photograph. But what I wanted to mention was they were this group was an engineering company that was formed here in Pittsburgh. And so they all knew each other, or some of them were even paisans from the old country who immigrated here. They formed this company. They trained, I believe, at Fort Dix, and then they went over to France. Now, by the time they got there, I think this campaign was underway. Whatever work they did was in the rear lines in that, but they stayed long enough to almost accumulate a year of service before they came home. So I'm kind of like on the hunt for more information about who organized them and what happened. But I believe this was a path to citizenship because he became an American citizen after this, after they got back. But I actually have his discharge papers and a nice group photo of that whole company in my possession there. So at least that's a starting point.
Huge numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were drafted and volunteered for the Army during World War I. Huge numbers of people who didn't speak English served in the Army. The 77th Infantry Division was from New York. It was called the Metropolitan Division. It was probably the most ethnically diverse division that we had. I think Robert says in his book that there were 42 different languages spoken in that division, and that for that reason, it made it very easy for the Germans to infiltrate. They would put on American uniforms, they would stand in line, they would cross into the American sector, and they would stand in line in a mess hall, and nobody, cared that they had an accent. They didn't stand out at all, and there was a lot of spying that way. Such an interesting, but you're right, it was a pathway to citizenship and to becoming, American. Fascinating story. This has been so great. Henry Shepke, thank you so much for joining us, and Connor Ritchie from Lafayette, thank you for joining us. Thank you all for sticking with us this long evening. If there's any other comments or questions people have before we go, I will say that, okay, then I will say good night, everybody, and have a good week. Stay well, all right? Take care.